Hello, I'm Abayomi.
I'm Anju.
And we're a couple. I am British born, but my parents are from, well, my grandparents from Jamaica. Dad was born in Jamaica, came here when he was 9, and my mum was born here.
My parents were both born in India, and my dad came over when he was 13. My mum followed when she was about 18, and they got married in England. I'm born in England, and yeah, that's me.
And the reason that we've kind of done this recording is because we've got quite a unique experience, haven't we? Being a sort of mixed or interracial relationship, and having kids that are mixed race, not the classical white black mixed race, but Indian black, and then kind of growing up here as second generation Brits, first to second generation, born British, and having experience in terms of our, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but we definitely are experts by
our lived experience.
Yeah, by experience. And so I just thought we thought it would be good for us to have this, like a series of conversations basically around race and current events and what's happening specifically around race. So we're at the 12th of June 2020. George Floyd has sadly passed. That's obviously sparked this whole new wave of the
movement.
A new wave of the movement. But I mean, people have attached it to the Black Lives Matter agenda, which it isn't strictly, but that's it's a good thing. And there's momentum that's being gained in terms of the movement. For the most part, people aren't political and they aren't sort of stuck on this particular brand. So it's not necessarily Black Lives Matter the brand, but it definitely is Black Lives Matter the sentiment. And people are both black and white and everything in between are pushing and are marching and are protesting to try and get some movement in equality, some improvement in equality in Britain. And so this isn't just black people, as I said, and it's not just white people. It's everybody, and it's decent people who want to see equality in Britain. And as part of that, there was a deplinthing of Edward Colston in Bristol last week during some protests, and that has been sort of misconstrued to be this angry mob of black people who tore down this statue. They're sort of anti-national, anti-patriotic, and they've kind of done this angry mob. But if you look at the footage, you'll see it was actually white men who were doing this, and they pulled down that statue. You have to also know the backstory was that wasn't just some senseless mob that did that, but for years they've been petitioning. These taxpayers and citizens in Bristol have been petitioning to get that statue removed. And the rationale behind that is that Edward Colston was a prolific slave trader, and many people died because of his trade and his behaviours. Many black Africans. And it's not so,
and the main point, it's not something to be celebrated, is it? It's not something that should be out, up for celebration. It's to have it in a town like that or in a city like that. It's just you kind of, I wouldn't say worshipping him or anything like that, but it's like an icon, isn't it? And it's for everybody to see this great guy. When we put things like that up in cities and towns, they are normally reserved for people of great stature, and great, for greatness, basically.
Yeah.
That's what we do. That do those kind of things. If we're going to have a monument or something, it's to glorify something more times than not. So I think it's just, if people have been asking for that to be taken down as a sign of multicultural Britain, we live in multicultural Britain, it doesn't fit for our society as it is today. It doesn't even represent our society today. So we shouldn't. My particular thoughts about it are that it shouldn't be out there on the streets. It should be reserved for a museum, just like we go to visit other things in a museum, horrific things and barbaric things that have happened in history, and we'll go and see them in a museum. We wouldn't want them to be displayed. We don't see slave shackles, you know, put up on a pedestal for everybody to see. I think it's you know it's important to, you know, that's in a museum, and it's in a museum for a reason, because, you know, that's, you know, we need to remember it, but it shouldn't be there for the street. That's
Agreed,
what I think. Yeah.
And so the debate has been this week around a number of similar monuments, which has glorified largely white British men or white European men, and just sort of what the meaning is behind this, and what should happen to them, and does it mean that, you know, we need to start you know, deconstructing the whole of the country. And there has been some real conversations about this, and some real passionate, understandably passionate viewpoints, you know, on that. And you're right. I think there is something about history and what history means to us. And I'm a strong believer in you know, sort of making sure that the ancient landmarks remain. But there is, as you said, a distinction between remembering and having them remain, and celebrating those things. And I think, as you said, in modern culture, in modern Britain, and in a multicultural Britain, it's hurtful to have those things celebrated, and it's also in bad taste, isn't it? It's in bad taste as a you know, a multicultural society. And so the conversation has been had amongst other people around Winston Churchill, and it's mad because we've had some conversations individually, you know, between ourselves, individually with other people, online with our friends, online with our friends, and, you know, with strangers as well.
Yeah, and just, you know, I think, yeah, that happening obviously that has sparked the wider debate now about you know, looking at all of these icons that and these monuments that are up, and figures that are up and around our country, and what we're going to do about it. You know, is it right that we remove them, or should they stay? You know, that's the conversation that's going on at the moment. You know, and the conversations that I've certainly had are just like, you know, that, you know, we should keep it up. You know, there's certain
schools
of thought. Yeah, you know, there's certain people that will say, yeah, slave traders, 100%, you know, out and out racist, yeah, like that needs to go. But, you know, as for the likes of somebody like Winston Churchill, for example, no, he must stay because he's our great war hero. But, you know, you need to look at the history of that great war hero, and then if it's brought to you that great war hero is actually not just a hero. He was a hero maybe to some, but, you know, I'm pretty sure to the people that he has been offensive to, I'm sure he's not a war hero to them. And I think it's recognising that, educating yourself about that, knowing that, and seeing why people would feel away. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that my parents are of Indian descent. Now, I know Winston Churchill said some very hurtful, some very disgusting things about Indians. Yeah, derogatory things about Indians. Racist, that's call it what it is.
Bigoted, racist, white supremacist things about.
I was thinking more about, when I said disgusting, I was thinking more about when he said about Indians breeding like rabbits. Like, you know, that's, you know, and that was actually a direct explanation that he was giving for the cause of the famine that happened in 1943 while we were still at war, and Britain and India as its ally were at war. So yeah, it's just crazy, like, just to think that, you know, he can say such things and people still want to revere, respect, honour and hold in high esteem a person like that, and say, you know, he must stay. You know, it's just like, how narrow-minded can you be? Like, to not even think that you're offending somebody, or that is actually offensive to people.
I don't think they understand, is the truth. For the majority of the people that I've spoken to and who have opposed my views, they seem to come from the point of view of just literally not knowing. So they've learned this sort of very basic, you know, up to GCSE level of historical teaching and learning, and they don't really understand what he's done. They couldn't tell you any facts and figures, and if they can, they're sort of limited to the realms of what we learned, the basics of you know, this is what happened, you know, from a sort of a war victor's kind of story. Do you know what I mean? So it's not, there's no real detail to it. It's just he's a hero. He won the war for us. Without him, we'd be speaking German. That's a real rhetoric that gets thrown around, right? But if we're factual about those things, and if we really educate ourselves around those things, it's not so far from the truth, but it's disingenuous. You know what I'm saying? Because that isn't true, and a lot of it is given to sort of imagination and supposition. Do you know what I mean? Or supposing what might have happened had he not, had been involved in the ways that he was. But it's just not. It's not true of the man either. He's not. He certainly wasn't a hero. He certainly wasn't a good person. He wasn't, in my opinion, a decent human being because of his behaviours. And maybe we should talk about those, because I can imagine even now, anyone watching this who is or has had that level of education or has got that sort of an affinity or a respect or sentiment, positive sentiment towards Winston Churchill, would see us as being, somehow offensive to them.
Something.
Right.
Cause, and that's the thing. Like you saying that they don't know this thing. I've had conversations where I've actually detailed information, facts about the things that Winston Churchill said. Like, for example, he said he hated Indians. This is Britain. This is Winston Churchill talking about his friends, the Indians, the people that are allies alongside him.
So let's give context to that. So we're talking Second World War, right? So the First World War has ended. Started 1914, ended at 1918. Second World War now, World War II is 1939, finishes in 1945, right? Yeah. We're talking about in 1943. So right in the middle of these Indian. How many Indians were involved?
In the war.
Yeah.
Fighting.
Yeah, for Britain. Yeah. As allies to Britain.
Yeah, between 3 and 4 million.
Okay, so let's say 3.5 million. Let's be fair, right? So 3 to 3.5 million, yeah. And we know that 87,000 of that number ended up dying for Britain, right? Yeah. So when we're talking about credit, to Winston Churchill for saving us and for causing us not to be under Hitler's regime, you have to give credit to to sort of to be remiss and to be purposely forgetful of what India has done. From a British point of view, is disingenuous and it's ungrateful and it's disrespectful.
It's mad because the conversations that I've had anyway, it's like you're giving the information and it'd be like, we know he was racist, and
everybody was at that time.
Everybody's at that time. That was just how they were taught. That's how they were brought up. Okay, all right, maybe, but you've got to remember, like, the British Raj was, in rule. The Indians didn't get their independence till 1947. So in 1943, they were still ruling in India. So for me, that would either mean that they have taken them on as their people, and certainly they're fighting your war, fighting in the British war against British enemies.
We know what India's sentiment was towards Britain. They called her the motherland, just like the Caribbeans did. They considered Britain to be the motherland, so they looked at her as being as a mother would be to like how a child would look towards their mother. With that sort of a fierce loyalty, devotion, all that stuff. And
then you'll give the you were saying that they don't know, so I've given them information. I've given the information that the facts and figures that you just mentioned about the 87,000 people dying. Like, that's not a small number. Like, have you really thought about that? It's 87,000 people. That's how many people fought in the war. Like, that's a lot of people. How many
Indian people fought for Britain as allies in the war?
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that's just Indians. Like, there's other nations that also did the same. The Caribbean also fought alongside Britain. So it's just it's
and those people fought at very key points in the war and at key locations in the war, at key battlefronts. And if you were to research, which we encourage everyone to do after we've spoken about this, or as we're talking about this, research it, Google it, see see for yourself, or what other search engine, have a look for yourself and see. This is very easily found stuff, easily researched stuff. This is key to them. So to say Winston Churchill was responsible for our victory isn't actually the truth. These people came in and they helped Britain, as did America, as did other European allies. We know this.
And this is why it's so offensive, because these Indians have fought for the war. You've engineered a famine to happen in India during the war. that killed 4 million people. Okay, we won the war. You know, we won the war. We fought. You know, we beat Hitler. But you kill at what cost? You know, at what expense? You kill people to do that. You know, you actually and you
killed your allies.
Friends,
Yeah,
you know, or your people that you know you were in guardianship of. Like that to me is like highly offensive.
Right.
Like, you know. And how I see people arguing against that, it's just like, because it doesn't affect you directly, so it might not have been your ancestors, but it could have been mine, you know, that got killed in that. So it's just like, well, you know, it's
there's a real lack of care in the British psyche. I find this exactly what you just said there. There's something about a total disregard if it doesn't affect us. Do you know what I mean? There's no sort of humanity or empathy. And that's true of individuals, so it's got to be true of society as well, where there is in the British psyche, and I say the British psyche, I really mean the white British psyche, if I'm honest, although I think it does affect others who have been influenced by this way of thinking, but largely and by majority, the people I'm talking about are white. They've got this sort of sentiment that doesn't allow them to sort of empathise with others, you know, or it's sort of, it's kind of, Let's give examples. Let's make it clear. So what we're talking about, what actually happened with this famine in 1943.
So in 1943, 3 to 4 million Indians died, basically, as a result of Winston Churchill ordering British officials over in India to continue the exports of rice and of wheat from India to support the war efforts in Britain. So that obviously left no food for the Indians to eat, and the cries that were coming were actually from British officials in India to Churchill to say the people are starving, basically. They're starving, like there's no food here, and he didn't care, and his response was, obviously I've mentioned it already, they shouldn't breed like rabbits. Like, okay, so that in my opinion is not a good person. that those kind of words, and him saying I hate the Indians, they're a beastly, they come from they're a beastly people. Like, wow, okay, like these are the people that are actually allies and are fighting the war alongside your white British and British soldiers. Like, what kind of man was he? And that's where it comes down. That's where it comes down for me. Right. It's like, that's not a person that should be on a pedestal. Right. Like, he should be in a museum.
Absolutely.
We know this now.
So what I'm finding though is the rhetoric is largely, but he beat the largest fascist. So they almost compare Hitler and his 6 million deaths in terms of Jews and gypsies and people of ethnic minorities and disabled people, etc., etc. They compare this Hitler to Winston Churchill, and they almost see it. They see it. I can tell by what they say, obviously, on the evidence.
He killed the bigger racist, basically. That's what I don't know if people say.
So he killed the fascists. He killed the biggest racist, the bigger racist. But they failed to recognise that Winston Churchill was not far behind. So, in all the things that he did, as you mentioned, with this one specific engineered famine in 1943 in Bengal, 3 to 4 million people died. And we know also, don't we, that what he was trying to do was, in the diversion of food away from India, away from his allies, what he actually ended up doing was having this produce fed to feed horses in the war. So it was almost like he valued the life of equine stock, horses, animals, more than he did
human life,
black humans or brown humans in this case. And so it's clear, and people generally accept that Winston Churchill was a racist anyway. But not only was he a racist,
you cannot deny it. Yeah. I think it's all out there. So that's the conversations that I'm getting. Yeah. Like, he was a racist. We know he's a racist, but he was a hero and he did this and this. But that's not not good enough, is it? Like, to just say that now.
And a decent human being, a decent human being wouldn't say that either. Yeah. We know, and the worst thing about it is, is they understand and know it's not something that they're totally ignorant to, because we know with the whole Jimmy Savile thing, Jimmy Savile, we found out after he was Uncle Jimmy, Sir Uncle Jimmy, so we knighted him, we called him our uncle, we looked at him as a hero similarly, from a white British perspective. We found out afterwards with certainty that he was a prolific paedophile. You know, he was an abuser of children. And certain judgments were made. You know, he didn't.
Rightly so.
Right,
yeah.
Absolutely. And part of those judgments, from a social perspective, was that they removed his statue. There was a wooden, I believe, statue of him in Glasgow, and that was deplinthed. And you know, there was no sort of outcry about or uproar about that, simply because we understand that. Yeah, obviously, there's a level of celebration that we give to other human beings. But if we find out at some later date that what we thought about them or what we believed about them wasn't glorious or was inglorious or ignoble, that, you know, that they can be removed and deplinth. And so, but what they're trying to make it sound like is that it's some sort of an attempt of anti-nationalists or anti-patriotic people to destroy British heritage, but that's not what it is at all, man. There is a real offence, you know. There is a real offence, and you know, at the same time, I do get why people are passionate about it.
Yeah, same.
It's, you know, but if you arm yourself with education, you'll also understand the other side of the debate, which is that Winston Churchill was no hero, and overall, I mean, we need to wrap this up for time, but overall, I think the general sort of question right now at this time is, you know, what's going to happen with the world? What's going to happen with the country? You know, do we remove things or don't we remove things? And I don't think it's a sort of, you know, let's decide now about everything. I think it has to be a case by case decision that's made. You know, we live in a democratic society. We live in a multicultural society, and there should be this element of democracy and thought and consideration that's given to each statue, you know, and monument, you know, one by one, by its merits. But I'd love to see more of this. I'd love to see more conversation around it, and I'd also love to see more of those you know, grotesque celebrations of evil men removed. You know, we live in a society that we like to call ourselves more civilized and more decent. You know, Britain, we have no moral high ground if we don't get these sort of things right, and then we don't have any.
And you know, argument. We know what to do, like you said, like with the Jimmy Saviles of the world. Yes, given he was, you know, he abused children, and you know, I think that's like just overarching. Everybody thinks that blanket that's wrong in it. It was wrong, and it's disgusting and it's terrible. You know, we all agree on that. But this thing about, you know, race and racism, it's a sticking point, isn't it? And which then goes to show, like, it just shows people's racism. It comes out in these kind of situations, because in the same way that you would say that man is not worthy anymore of our glorification, our celebration, or anything like that, why can't you see it for a man such as Winston Churchill? Why can't you see it like the same way as in he did wicked things, he was racist, he killed, he committed genocide, you know,
mass murder and genocide.
That's what it was.
And obviously that's just one incident, man. You know, we also know that he used chemical weapons against the Afghans and Kurds. We know that, you know, he was a blatant racist, you know, in terms of his language, even for black British people here at that time, you know, against, you know, the colonies, black people in the colonies, and people of different minorities in the colonies. You know, there's some real comparisons that you can draw between him and Hitler, and we would never have you know, statues of Hitler paraded around and celebrated. We wouldn't have that in Britain, partially because of the fact that you know, they were our enemies, and he's considered, you know, the enemy of Britain. But it's exactly, we're talking about the same spirit, man.
And we were just saying, like we were saying about the whole, you know, we in history we're taught about Hitler as the big bad guy in it, like, and he was, you know, he was a wicked man. He killed people and he murdered people, and he was very racist, very overtly racist. And you know, with Winston Churchill, and
he was white supremacist as well, specifically.
Exactly. So with Winston Churchill, he was very much covert, you know, whereas he wasn't out there. He wasn't like, you know, addressing the nation, saying these things. It was more between British officials and behind
the insiders.
Behind closed doors.
And it's only because now we're able to look into those memoirs and those conversations, and we can see now. You know,
it's coming out.
Racism.
So, you know, now that we know, it's really important to now consider, is this man worthy? Was this man worthy? Like, what are we going to do about it now?
And I think that's telling of our characters as well. And also an important point that you raised there as well. There is something about the sort of the spectrum of racism. And I think there is, you know, obviously very overt racism, the kind of, you know, go back to your own country, go back to where you came from kind of racism, you know, using the N word and the P word, etc., etc. There is that kind of racism which is overt and tangible and recognisable, all the way down to very subtle racism and microaggressions and things that exist in people's attitudes and ideologies that even they probably wouldn't even understand. So what I'm saying very clearly is I believe on the sort of lower end of racism that it's possible to be racist and not even know it, right? But that's judged by, because racism really is about supremacy, isn't it? It's about the supremacy of your own race, specifically the white race in this context. And there were sort of very academic debates about racism and, you know, what constitutes racism. And some would argue, for example, that it's impossible to be racist if you're not white, right? But it definitely is telling of your character and of your sort of your ideologies if you would have a man or men like this, or women even, you know, like this, who we recognise and we identify as being specifically racist. And maybe there needs to be a kind of criteria or a checklist or something where case by case it's looked at. But as a society, absolutely, we live in a multicultural Britain, and our culture now, today in 2020, should represent that, and certainly our monuments and statues should. So yeah, definitely. Good.
Yeah, so, you know, we just want you to go back, research, look at the information, you know, check out the stuff that we've said, and just check it out for yourself and just see what you think now. You know, having listened to this, just see what you think. You know, what's your take on it now, as a result of our conversation.
And our plan is that this is a standalone conversation, but that it will fit like a jigsaw into the sort of wider scheme of things that we're going to be talking about around race. So, yeah, man, we're interested in feedback as well. So, however you can give that, let's get that. But yeah, it's about moving forward and having equality as at the forefront of our minds, because it's everyone's Britain, and so we want to, you know, we want to ensure that everybody is represented and equality is a real thing.